Microtonal music is broadly defined as music written in any tuning system other than our standard 12-note system. So, for example, whereas our 12-note system divides an octave into 12 equal divisions, a 24-note system would divide an octave into 24 equal divisions. Typically, microtonal tuning systems have more than 12 notes per octave, which gives rise to notes found in between semitones and hence the name microtonality. Although not typically used in most mainstream music, microtonality is in no way a new concept, but has actually existed for quite some time already. And with recent advancements in technology, it has never been easier for musicians to write and play microtonal music. Which brings us back to this video, in which I want to give you the right tools so that you can start putting your own microtonal ideas to paper. More specifically, we'll explore how notation works when writing in tuning systems outside of the 12-note system. And in order to help you better visualize everything, we'll also construct a 1-octave keyboard for each of these systems by using our familiar 12-note keyboard as a foundation. As a first example, let's consider an octave divided into 19 equal divisions as opposed to 12, which we'll call 19-edo. Such a system only has 7 notes more than the 12-note system, so our 19-edo keyboard could be labeled like this. In this tuning system, we are still able to use our familiar musical symbols from 12-edo notation, but with 2 small changes. First, unlike in 12-edo tuning, C-sharp is no longer inharmonically equivalent to D-flat, as there are now 2 distinct notes. Similarly, D-sharp is no longer inharmonically equivalent to E-flat, and so on. Second, a new note is now introduced in between E and F, and another is also introduced in between B and C. However, unlike the previous case, E-sharp is indeed inharmonically equivalent to F-flat. And similarly, B-sharp is inharmonically equivalent to C-flat. Although this tuning system did not require any new notation symbols, the key takeaway here is that notes such as C-sharp and D-flat, which would have been considered as inharmonically equivalent in 12-edo, are now 2 distinct notes. Next, let's bump up the number of notes per octave to 24. Since the system now has double the number of notes compared to 12-edo, a new note is effectively being introduced for every semitone, giving rise to what we call quartertones. For that reason, the system is also sometimes referred to as quarter-tone tuning. In order to have a notation system that fully captures every note found in 24-edo, new accidentals must be introduced. One way to notate these new notes is via the mainstream quarter-tone notation system, as shown. Here, we see that we have retained our familiar accidentals for the neutral, sharp, flat, double sharp, and double flat. And in between each of these accidentals, we now have the flat and a half, the half flat, the half sharp, and the sharp and a half. Going back to our 24-edo keyboard, we can see that C-sharp and D-flat are once again inharmonically equivalent. However, we also see that there's now an extra note in between C and C-sharp and another one in between C-sharp and D. Since both of these notes are found right in the middle of a semitone, we can use the half-sharp and half-flat accidentals to label them accordingly. This same process can then be applied for the notes in between D and E, and so on. Note that we have also retained the black notes in between E and F and in between B and C that were first introduced in 19-edo. However, in order to maintain consistency with the spacings between the other notes in this system, E sharp is now E half sharp or F half flat, and B sharp is now B half sharp or C half flat. So an ascending chromatic scale can then be notated as such. An interesting aspect about 24-edo is that C half sharp is actually inharmonically equivalent to D flat and a half. And similarly, D half flat is inharmonically equivalent to C sharp and a half. Take a moment to visualize this in your head. Now let's increase the number of notes to 31. The first change we notice is that the singular black note found in between E and F and in between B and C is now split into 2. Accordingly, the lower notes would be E half sharp and B half sharp, while the higher notes would be F half flat and C half flat. The second change is that C sharp and D flat are once again no longer inharmonically equivalent, just like in 19-edo, with the lower note being C sharp and the higher note being D flat. So our fully labeled keyboard would look something like this. We can also see that D flat is inharmonically equivalent to C sharp and a half, while D half flat is inharmonically equivalent to C double sharp. And a similar process can be applied to C sharp and C half sharp. See if you can figure out other inharmonic equivalents on this keyboard. As a last example to illustrate the mainstream quarter-tone notation system, let's divide an octave into 41 equal divisions. A keyboard in this tuning system would look something like this. Pause the video and see if you can figure out the labels for each of these notes. By making use of every new symbol introduced from quarter-tone notation, one way of labeling our keyboard could be as such. So far, we've only been using the mainstream quarter-tone notation system to account for any new notes found outside of 12-edo. but the number of new extentos introduced by this system is still rather limited. What if we wanted to use a tuning system that happens to have more than 8 notes between C and D? How would we be able to account for every note? Well, one solution could be to use what's called the Sagittal notation system, a system that is capable of notating musical pitches in nearly all possible tunings by using a universal set of microtonal accidentals. Although a full comprehensive guide to using this notation system would be a bit much for the scope of this video, the developers themselves have already made an excellent tutorial detailing how their notation system works, the link for which is in the description below. Earlier in the video, I said that microtonality was not frequently used in music. But this statement is really only true for Western music. For example, in traditional Persian music, which frequently makes use of microtones, the karn and sari symbols are used to indicate quartertone intervals. So, in other words, the karn is equivalent to the half flat from the mainstream quartertone notation system, while the sari is equivalent to the half sharp. At the end of the day, there are many different ways of notating microtonal music, and each of these systems has their own pros and cons. Some are easy to learn, while others help make your score less cluttered. But as long as your notation is clear and logical, what matters most is the actual music you write.